TEEB stands for the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. Perhaps we should have called it the economics of nature, because that's what it's about. And the challenge here is that nature provides a lot to us every day in terms of food, fuel, fiber, but also ecosystem services like flood prevention and drought control, which forests provide, or pollination, which bees provide for agriculture. But most of these services that nature provides are for free. They are public services. We don't measure their value. The net result is we ignore them. You cannot manage what you do not measure. We don't manage the resources that nature puts at our disposal for free. That's why you need TEEB. You need to understand the value of ecosystem services. You need to understand that they have to be not at the periphery of your thinking, but at the heart and center of your policy for agriculture, for managing ecosystems, for desertification, for water. All of these need ecosystem services, and yet we don't even know what they are and how much they're worth to us every day. Well, TEEB is really a structured approach towards explaining to countries, to local governments, and to businesses how you can understand the value of the ecosystem services that are received by them and important for them. So we provide the framework, we provide the methodologies, and then we help governments through the so-called country TEEB studies that are going on these days, almost 25 of them, and we help companies by encouraging them to look at our methodologies and to use them to assess the value that nature provides to the business and the impacts that business has on nature, which can be negative. If you think about how nature provides us the hugely valuable agricultural productivity, it comes partly from a global rainfall cycle, which is all about forests and rainforests generating the rainfall that comes to us. We don't recognize that, we don't measure it, we don't value it, and the net result, we lose forests. They are some of our most valuable and most important assets, natural assets around the world, essential for providing the rainfall around the world, and yet we lose them. Another example, look at pollinators. Bee-based pollination and insect-based pollination has been estimated to be worth almost $200 billion. That's nearly 12% of the global agricultural output. And of course, it's not just a question of how much is it worth, which is essential. How could you manage without pollinators? And yet, we don't measure the value of pollination, and therefore we lose it. So agriculture actually, in a very significant way, depends upon ecosystem services, and yet this link in its economic significance has not truly been appreciated. So that's one dimension. But the other dimension is agricultural systems also provide ecosystem services, and that's valuable, and we need to understand that across different forms of agriculture. Some agricultural systems provide more, others provide less. Some agricultural systems actually have huge costs to ecosystems, and therefore, because of the excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides, which have damaging impacts on human health or local communities or soil fertility, we also incur costs to society, which are again invisible. So you see, the economic invisibility of nature is a double problem, both in terms of what we don't appreciate ecosystems provide to agriculture and what we don't appreciate agriculture may cost to ecosystems. Here's why we need TEEB for agriculture. The two have to combine. It is one spectrum, and it needs to be understood, it needs to be recognized, it needs to be valued, and it needs to be integrated into policies and business practices. We live in a world where we have 7 billion plus people, and they all need food. And soon we will be in a world which has 8 or 9 billion people by 2050 who need food. And the normal response is, oh, we need to grow crops in more land, convert more lands to agricultural land. And in fact, one has to think whether that's really the answer. If we look at land today, that is agriculture, and look at productivity, two things are very important. One is to understand that more than half, almost 60% of the land on earth is actually tilled in small farms. It's not massive industrial complexes. And this is important in two ways. One, because we have here the livelihoods of more than 1 billion farmers in the developing world. And if we can only figure out some way of improving the productivity of their land, improving the output that they get per hectare, that would be a huge solution to two big problems. One is poverty, because they would get more income, and the other is hunger, because there would be more food going around. We are talking about huge increases possible on small farms around the world using ecologically friendly farming methods. The studies done by Jules Pretty and by the FAO demonstrate that there can be increases of in like one of these studies 79%, in another of these studies 180%, if we only apply ecologically friendly approaches to these farms. We have to look at that as a key opportunity. How do we get ecologically friendly farming to work in a way so that externalities, as in the costs to society of doing industrialized farming, are diminished, and the benefits to the poor of getting more yield in their small farms is increased? We will have solved two big problems: hunger and poverty. There are around 25 TEEB country studies that have been started at various stages of progress. As these studies come to fruition, what we will find is that they are providing the countries who are engaging them the infrastructure, the toolkit, if you like, to value ecosystem services and their benefits for policy areas as significant as animal husbandry and agriculture, and the reduction of rural poverty, and the prevention of desertification, and the assurance of fresh water supply. All of these are important policy areas in most developing countries. And for all of these, ecosystem services are critical components. When these are valued, then choices can be made by policymakers properly informed about the value of what the forest is for your agriculture, for desertification prevention, for preventing soil erosion, etc., etc. That will generate the impetus for investing in ecological infrastructure, for not assuming that a lost forest is simply a nothing. It can be ignored. It's not. It's a huge cost to society and to the economy, and that needs to be recognized, valued, and pressed into policy space. That's what it will do. Invisibility of nature is, of course, a huge intellectual challenge. We don't truly sometimes understand the nature of the ecosystem services that nature delivers and to whom they benefit. But once we have worked out ecosystem functions and how they work, the next challenge is valuing them. How much is this worth to the economy, to the country, to the state, of the province, and to the business? And with the business, there is a tendency to take this huge global free lunch for granted. Not only that, but at the same time to inflict damage upon the provider of that free lunch, which is nature. There was a study done recently by Trucost, a research firm in London, which estimated that the total environmental externalities, in other words, the costs to the environment and to society of doing business as usual, was something like $2.1 trillion, $2.1 million, 3.5% of global GDP, from the top 3,000 companies. Now, what they're clearly doing is creating third-party costs, in other words, creating social costs whilst making private profits. That's a free lunch. That can't go on. We need to explain to them why it's important that these costs, be it in the form of emissions or freshwater extraction or pollution or waste, we need to explain to them that these costs are huge, that somebody is bearing them, and that their business practices must improve in order to reduce these costs and create profits, private profits, without social costs. Today, we have what I call Corporation 1920. That's the dominant model. It creates private profits in a buccaneering kind of way, and it creates social costs. We can't have that going forward. We need Corporation 2020. If you look at ecosystem services, sometimes people say, well, yes, of course they're valuable, but they are 5%, 10%, 15% of GDP, and indeed, if you wish to measure them that way, that's what they will be. However, that's not really the right question. The right question is, who suffers if you withdraw ecosystem service? In other words, whose fields and farms will suffer if rainfall doesn't happen, or if soil fertility declines as a result of lost forests? It's the poor farmer. Whose wife cannot go into the forest to collect fuel wood for cooking? 60% of the world's families depend on fuel wood for cooking. Once again, it's the poor farmer. Whose cattle and goats can't go into the forest to collect leaf litter if the forest isn't there anymore? The poor farmer. So if you really work out who are the real sufferers in the absence of ecosystem services, your answer tends to be it is the poor farmer, the poor fisherman, and the forest-dependent tribal or villager. So the real question to ask is, what are ecosystem services as a fraction of the household incomes of the rural poor? And that answer, when we did this calculation in one of the TEEB studies, that answer in the case of India was 47% on average. In the case for that's for 350 million people who depend on these services. In Indonesia, for almost 100 million people, that answer was close to 75%. In Brazil, for 20 million people who depend on the gathering of nuts and fruit and so on in the northern Amazon, that answer was 89% on average. Now, that's the whole point. You have to think of ecosystem services consumed by the poor as a fraction of the GDP of the poor. Then you realize how important they are. That's what we mean by GDP of the poor. We fail to appreciate the real value of ecosystem services for development because we think of them as fractions of national GDP. That's a pointless exercise. It doesn't solve or prove anything. When you start looking at ecosystem services for the value they deliver to the poor household, you realize that there cannot be a sensible development model which destroys the GDP of the poor. You have to maintain the GDP of the poor, and on top of that, build education, build better health services, build a diversity of alternative employment opportunities. That's true development. The TEEB studies were launched in 2010 at the so-called COP10, the 10th Conference of Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Since then, we have had a lot of interest from many nations to take on the thinking of TEEB and try and introduce it into their national policy-making agendas, which means, of course, not just the Environment Ministry. It means everything from finance, in other words, adjusting national accounts, to agriculture, in other words, supporting ecologically friendly agricultural models, to freshwater, in other words, looking at forestry as a source, as an upstream supplier of water, and so on. So there's a lot of thinking that has been revitalized in this space. But I think the real benefits of TEEB will come when these countries who are engaged in the TEEB studies have actually put together the information and presented them into their planning departments. Aspects and indicators like GDP of the poor can be measured. A couple of countries have already started looking at this measurement. When it comes to the business, I think the single most important outcome really needs to be looking at sectors of business which are big contributors to some of the costs, biological costs, ecological costs, and that means looking at polluting sectors, looking at agriculture and its costs in terms of land use change and its costs in terms of pollutants, pesticides and fertilizers. All of this really needs to be examined holistically, but in a very rigorous and systematic way. So we can't really have individual companies coming out making possibly very good claims about what their impacts are and what they will do about them. We need this to be done on an industry sector basis. It can't be a single maker of shoes and shirts which declares what its estimates are, and it has to be all of them. It can't just be one cement manufacturer, it has to be the entire group of large cement manufacturers. It can't be one farm or one particular grower of beef which looks at its impacts and tries to do it in a more ecologically friendly way. It has to be all of them, right? So now we need to work with business sectors, working together, looking at ways of measuring their impacts, understanding that it is their social responsibility to reduce negative impacts, and then working collaboratively with the relevant governments to achieve that. An example of steps in the right direction have been taken already by Paul Pullman's initiative, which is called the Tropical Forest Alliance. It's actually an initiative begun by the Consumer Association in the US and supported by Paul Pullman, the chairman of Unilever, and supported by the president of Indonesia, Mr. Yudhoyono. Their first meeting was in June in 2013, where they pulled together 4 major agricultural and forestry industries which had huge impacts on rainforests, these being beef and soya and pulp and paper and palm oil. And the objective of this Tropical Forest Alliance is to ensure that these 4 major contributors to deforestation in the tropics can actually bring down that deforestation to 0 by 2020. That's a huge challenge, but that's a noble challenge, and that's the right challenge to take on. And in my opinion, this is the right way to take it on, because we are not here talking about one or the other company trying to do its own thing and then effectively ending up with competitive pressures and ending up with a first mover disadvantage. We're talking about entire sectors moving collaboratively together with the key governments involved, which means Indonesia, Brazil, India, China, the USA, etc. That's the right model. It's got to be a sectoral, cooperative model supported by the relevant governments. Entire sectors have to move together. So I think this is where we are going next, and TEEB can provide the kind of information that these sectors will need to move in this right direction.